We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
Okay, so in this version of This Is Your Life, we are going to start in, we're going to take it in order of the speakers, and so that means Alyssa, can you come up and regale us with some answers?
Hopefully.
So one of the things you spoke about was the problems with meat production in terms of the impact on planetary health. Mm-hmm. And so we got a couple of questions about that. So what about bioengineered meat for the future? Do you think this could help both with what it does in terms of saving the amount of methane produced as well as reducing health risks?
That one's easy. Yes, absolutely. Test tube meat all the way. I'm a huge fan, and I teach a lot of this information to my graduate students. We're making unbelievable strides in terms of actually being able to synthetically produce meat in a laboratory. And a lot of animal rights activists are also very pleased with this because it is ethically produced meat. It is sustainable. I think that we have some cognitive barriers we might need to get past in terms of thinking about growing our hamburgers in a petri dish, but it is possible. So yes, that is actually, there are big strides being made in that direction.
So one of the things that that does, if you have people retaining their original, their desire for meat, is it maintains that whole system. I think you envisage a possibility of a world without meat eating at all. At any rate, could you talk about what you think the role of vegetarianism and veganism is now and for the future?
I can. It's a very, I tried to dance very carefully along that line, but Richard just brought me right over to this big debate. So this is actually a very contentious debate amongst clinicians and nutritionists and nutritional anthropologists, actually, and eaters writ large. So I think that there is, I don't envision a world, personally, I can talk about myself. As a nutritional anthropologist, I don't see a world in which we are no longer eating meat. But I think it's a numbers game. So the numbers that I produced were from 2017, and I think that most of us buy the demographers' projections in terms of what the global population will be by 2050. So I do think that those projections, with the current state of factory farming and food production in general, are not sustainable. There are, so I think that we are making a lot of strides in terms of the way that meat is being, so the way that our animals are being treated and fed and the way that meat itself is being processed. And this is actually moving out of the developing world. So the US is actually pretty good, internationally speaking. And we're now doing a lot of work in the developing world with small-scale, non-industrial populations in terms of how they are treating their livestock. So this is a global pattern and something that the UN has been putting a lot of money and energy into addressing. In terms of vegetarianism in general, those numbers are on the rise. globally as well. So meat eating is going up, but so are people who, in the post-industrialized West in particular, you have a big shift to vegetarianism and veganism. So you see a switch. So the developing world is eating more meat, which is actually the majority of the world in terms of population size, and those in the post-industrialized West are eating more plants. And this also, in terms of sustainability, the whole farm-to-table movement has really taken off. And if you're interested, there's a lot of really interesting information available on the internet about vertical farming and about shipping containers that are now very popular in big cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, where you have indoor kind of hydroponic growing in these shipping containers that are outside in the parking lots of these eateries. So it really is farm to table. They're just micro farms in shipping containers.
So if you envisage a world in which meat eating is greatly reduced, then what are you doing to, well, let's say men? Because male chimpanzees eat more meat than females, and male humans eat more meat than female humans. Are you challenging our evolutionary psychology in a major way here? And why, where do you get the sex difference come from?
Well, first I would like to say I hope that I am not doing anything intentionally to men or women or anyone. I think that's a very interesting question and one I will try to handle. I think that the old adage, you are what you eat, I mean, this comes from somewhere, right? This is a concept that is not foreign to any of us. And I think that humans have it's not something we talked about today, but humans have a very emotional response to the food that they eat. There are also a lot of cultural practices and ritual practices that accompany food. I mean, we didn't talk at all today about cuisine or dietary differences around the world, or so there's a lot more to be said, and I think that we're trending into that part of this with that question. But I think that particularly clearly all the men in this room are confident enough in their masculinity that I don't think that it is at all tethered to eating meat. So that is how I will answer that question. All the men in my life don't need to eat meat.
All right, you can't beat that. So let's go to something else.
Thank you.
Here's a question. What do you think of Gary Taubes' work suggesting it's refined carbohydrates and not dietary fat that cause the diseases you mentioned?
I think that's very interesting work, and if I had been asked I have a lot to say about plant foods as well, probably more to say about plant foods than I do about the nutritional significance of meat. I do think that refined foods in general are highly problematic for nutritional reasons. I think a lot of this has to do with additives in addition to just refined carbohydrates. So I think it's very promising work. I think it's very interesting, and I think that we're asking the same questions. What is good for what is good for our bodies to eat? What are we adapted to eat? We're asking the same questions we've been asking for decades and decades, but our methods are becoming more elegant and refined. So I think I'm still waiting for more information to come, but whoever penned that question, I'm more than happy to talk to you in more detail about some of that specific work afterward, because I'm very interested in refined carbs as well.
So finally, we have a question that it comes straight out of the Salk Institute, as it were. The enzyme for decomposing new 5GC. When did it get lost and why? Is it there in other meat eaters?
Oh. Maybe I can ask Ajit Varki to come up and answer that question. So the CMAH gene was lost about approximately 2 million years ago. So what we know, so that was a very complicated slide. And as I said before, I did my postdoc in Ajit's lab, but I did a very small portion of a very large and important study. I mostly just did the lyophilizer and drove to local dairies and got all the dairy to analyze. But it's a really important study. And the reason the study is important, the reason everything coming out of the Varki lab is really important is because as a scientist, I like many different vectors, right? So if you can get evidence from many different lines, okay, all right, now we're saying something. And what's really interesting about the new 5GC case is it doesn't matter what lens you're using. It doesn't matter if you're using animal modeling. It doesn't matter if you're looking. It really doesn't matter. All the evidence, all the arrows are pointing to this. So the evolutionary story, which I did not say in my one little slide, we lost this gene. So when you find new 5GC in pretty much almost every animal, you do not find it in us other than what we are eating. So that's where the metabolic incorporation comes in. So we lost the ability to synthesize this particular gene approximately 2 million years ago. So it is very much integral to this story of meat eating. So how and when our species started eating meat and what the kind of metabolic consequences are of that consumption, they're important. So whether it's at the cellular level, whether you're dealing with animal modeling, whether you're in the Varkey lab like I was, lyophilizing cheese, all of it is part of this big story of humans and their history of meat eating.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Rebecca, are you willing to come and answer some questions? She's shaking her head, but that's not the way the game works. Okay. So you're looking nervous. You're not confident in your masculinity.
No.
Okay, so we have a question that actually came in from the streaming world. And it is about the female hunters. So the question is about their age and fertility status. Do they have a special age and fertility status? Are they generally older? Are they pregnant? Any characterization?
Yeah, so women hunt throughout their lives. When they're girls, they hunt very small lizards, little lizards called winjigiri in there on the rocks. And you turn over the rocks and look for the little, this is specialized kid activity, hunting for these little lizards. As they get older, they shift toward hunting for the monitor lizards. But when women are in their sort of teen and reproductive years, they split their time between hunting monitor lizards, hunting winjigiri in the rocks, and picking fruit and doing a lot of more sedentary activities. This is because babies are heavy and they're slow, and you want to go hunting, and you have all these kids with you, and they complain, it's boring, they want to go hunt winjigiri in the rocks. So you hunt with them for a while, or you hunt for a while, and then you got to go back and do things with the kids. So when women are younger and they're looking after the kids more, they'll be doing less hunting. And as you become older, indeed, as a postmenopausal woman, you become almost a specialized small animal hunter. Hunter. Not
a specialized small animal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I almost said that, didn't I?
No, that's good. Okay. All right. So here's another question about the women, about the ecology of the situation. The question is it possible that the willingness of the Matu to share is related to the abundance of the food resource? And the observation here is that the women in the photos and videos looked very well fed, even maybe overweight. And so, are they actually consuming some refined carbohydrates as well?
I would say yes, that is correct. Mardu contemporary diet in the Mardu community ranges between about 30 and 50%. This was between 2000 and 2010 when I was collecting a lot of this data. Between about 30 to 50% bush food, and then the remainder in the form of food that's purchased at a little shop in the community. It's very expensive to purchase food in the shop, and people get about a very small amount of money fortnightly from the Australian government, which is basically enough to supply maybe half the calories. So they generally end up buying a lot of white flour and making bread out of it, and that's basically what people subsist on. So contemporary diet today is actually quite poor in many respects. So that's why a lot of ladies are overweight. Also, we have problems of diabetes and similar sorts of metabolic issues that you find in a lot of indigenous communities.
So given that, do you think it's possible that because they are relatively well off in that respect, I mean from an energy point of view, that they're more willing to share? Or do you think that's something that goes back into times when they didn't have that resource?
No, definitely. As food becomes less scarce, people share less. So when everybody has equal amounts of food, food is very abundant, there's less sharing that goes on. Sharing becomes more and more critical the less food there is. And there's great efforts made to ensure that people who are hungry don't go hungry.
So there's efforts made to ensure that people who are hungry don't go hungry, but then the opposite also happens, that when they have more, then they make efforts to keep it all for themselves?
No, actually they don't. Most of the time, whenever there's a large harvest of something brought in, it's shared really widely. Have I just contradicted myself?
Well, maybe they share equally at all times, but it sounded as though you were saying they share more when resources are scarce.
I think that, yeah, there's a greater emphasis on ensuring the equality of food consumption when food is scarce across individuals, when there's a lot of asynchrony in how much each individual has.
So that's what we all want to hear, that people are nice in that way. Yeah. Now, here's a specific question about the sort of the utility of the sharing. Is more protein available to be given to nursing mothers?
I would think, actually, I don't know the answer to that question. I would think the women would get it themselves if they needed it. No, there's no special favoring of.
I'm pregnant, give me more food, or there's nothing like that.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so here's a slightly wacky question to end up with. Is there any support for the idea that female involvement in hunting and gathering has led to modern female shopping?
Shopping. I'm not sure how to answer that question. No.
Thank you so much. Okay, so those were the humans, and now let's have the chimps. And in terms of having the chimps, I think it would be great to have Ian and David come up together, because the questions are rather similar for the two of them. And we'll see if they can do some male bonding or illustrate some of the more violent propensities of chimpanzees.
I'm very low ranking.
I'm old and senescent.
Okay, so here's a question that's very specific to Ian and or David. What is the explanation for why bonobos eat and hunt less? Is it correlated with female social dominance, testosterone? Bonobos are genetically closer to Homo sapiens and may represent insights into inheritance against acquired behaviors. David, do you want to take the first shot at that?
Well, I'll answer not quite the last part of the question first. They aren't closer to humans. Both are equally close to humans phylogenetically, evolutionarily. That's a good question, and I don't think we really know the answer other than to say that, first of all, there is a lot of variation, as Ian pointed out, among different chimpanzee communities, not just different populations or chimps in different habitats. So there are chimpanzees who hunt about as infrequently as bonobos do, as far as we could tell. But still, a big difference seems to be that bonobos rarely hunt monkeys. And in some places, there are no observations of bonobos hunting monkeys at all. It's only recently that people have started to report some from Loikotal in the DRC, for example, and one other site now. And that might have something to do with the fact that bonobo males, their behavioral repertoire and their social strategies are quite different from those of male chimpanzees. They occasionally form coalitions with each other, but they don't form alliances with each other. If they do, it's much more likely to be with a female than, or if they do, it's with a female, not a male. And there are differences in the power balance between the sexes, and it might contribute to simply less inclination on the part of males to take the risks involved in hunting. But we don't really know the answer yet.
I'd like to also add that we don't necessarily want to equate aggression with hunting as well. I see it as hunting monkeys is foraging, and I mean it looks awful to us because they're tearing little monkeys apart. But work from Ngogo and a little bit of the work that I've done have demonstrated that there's some decoupling of chimp aggression, testosterone, and hunting behavior. So it's complicated.
There actually is some very nice data that Marissa Sobolewski collected at Ngogo showing that when male chimpanzees go on boundary patrols, so this is inter-community aggression, testosterone levels go up. And in fact, they go up before males set out on a patrol, as if somehow they're anticipating doing this. She didn't find the same difference with hunting. So no increase in testosterone associated with hunting.
So you spoke about the differences between bonobos and chimps and the way that they hunt. Could you just give a little bit more of a description about the way chimpanzees do hunt? For instance, do they go on hunts to look for opportunities to find monkeys, or is it all the result of running into monkeys by chance? And then when they do run into monkeys, what happens? Ian, do you want to take the first step?
Sure. The answer, of course, because they're chimpanzees, is that it varies. And I think that's one of the big take-home messages from this symposium, is that we should move away from talking about chimps writ large and talk more about chimps in different communities and understanding why we see the differences that we do. So at Tai and at Ngogo, the chimps do appear to go specifically on patrols or in search of Redcolobus monkeys. They go silent, although they're in the middle of their territory. They're making a beeline for where the monkeys are, and they definitely seem to be searching for them. At Gombe, Kanyawara, and elsewhere, it does not seem to be the case. It's definitely more as though they're moving from one fruit tree to the next, and they may take a slight detour if they hear monkeys, but it doesn't seem like they're really moving specifically to find them. Then I can talk about Gombe in particular, about what happens when a hunt occurs. It's usually, though there's a period of time when usually the males gather together underneath the monkeys, and they're looking up and sort of trying to assess, in my mind, they're trying to assess whether or not there are vulnerable individuals, the juveniles and infants. And then one or more individual chimps will rush up into the trees and chase the monkeys. It's my impression, and also I have data to back this up, that at least at Gombe, it certainly seems to be every chimp for himself. There does not seem to be any kind of coordination, and it's what we call a byproduct mutualism, in the sense that each individual is selfishly trying to get his own monkey, but in doing so creates chaos and makes it easier for other guys to hunt. And we've actually found evidence of specific individuals who are more keen hunters who sort of catalyze these hunts. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Variation, yes. The majority of Redcolobus hunts that we've seen at Ngogo have happened during these patrols, when the chimpanzees seem to look for monkeys to hunt, and will sometimes go for a couple of hours to try to find some. And then they may find some and decide not to hunt because the group is too small, or it's just a bad situation. And the subject of deferred consumption came up today with reference to humans and earlier hominins carrying parts of butchered carcasses or entire animals from one place to another, and then processing them further and consuming them there. Chimpanzees don't do that, except on a very small scale, when they will carry some meat away from the immediate location of a hunt. But I have seen them wait and patiently follow a group of Redcolobus, or simply wait under the monkeys for an hour or an hour and a half, and then the monkeys do something stupid. They put themselves in a bad position, and the chimps are up and after them like that. And then also, I would agree, it's very difficult to see on most occasions whether there is any real coordination among the individuals involved. Occasionally it's easy. So I once remember seeing Mingus at Ngogo, who was not the best at capturing monkeys, but he was the least afraid of taking on adult male Redcolobus, and he went up into a tree and got underneath this group of monkeys who were stationary above the chimps, and there were 18 other adult male chimpanzees on the ground below him, and he sat there for maybe 15, 20 minutes waiting for anyone else to come up to join him, and none of them did, so eventually he came down and no hunt. But at other times it's just chaos, but to us. Right. But the chimpanzees, as Ian said, are at least very good at playing off of each other and recognizing when someone else has done something that puts a monkey in a vulnerable position, and then making an effort to pick it off.
Just to change the topic a little bit from this, you've already spoken about your skepticism about any kind of relationship between violence towards members of their own species and hunting. However, there are a couple of questions about this, and let me put it this way. To what do you attribute the fact that chimpanzees are both violent and hunters, while bonobos are not? And that in humans there is lots of evidence showing that there is a relationship between hunting and violence. So Keith Otterbaum found that the groups in which you had a higher percentage of the diet coming from hunting were more likely to be involved in war. Any explanations for these correlations?
Is this question coming from the crowd, or is it coming from... Yeah. Right. David, do you want to take this one?
Okay, where do I start? We have a limited amount of time here. Bonobos are not quite as nonviolent as popular literature would have it, but there do seem to be some real differences between bonobos and chimpanzees on that score. Bonobos generally are afraid of, hostile towards neighbors, although there are intriguing reports of members of presumably different bonobo communities encountering each other and having peaceful and even friendly interactions with each other, which would not happen in chimpanzees. And bonobos are not known to engage in chimpanzee patrol-like behavior, going to look for opportunities to make attacks on neighbors. And whether that really contributes to, in itself, to the difference in hunting frequencies, and in particular differences in the hunting monkeys. Again, it's a good question, and it's hard to be certain. When it comes to the human ethnographic record, I happen to be co-teaching a course now with a couple of my colleagues that we call the Anthropology of War, and I could probably go on far too long about the questions about the variation in the reported frequency of warfare among historically documented hunter-gatherer groups, for example, but I don't think it's that simple that you can just look at a few figures and say, oh, well, this society hunted more than that one, and also they engaged in war more. In fact, there's some problems with the literature on the subject of variation in however we define it, and I'm begging a big question there in the frequency of war among hunter-gatherers.
I should just add that with regard to bonobos hunting, we still don't have fundamental data on the rate at which they're encountering potential prey. So that's one possible explanation.
Okay, I'm duly put in my place, and I'm going to resort to a final question, which raises a question about conservation. And the question is, do indigenous people living where chimps hunt primates also hunt and eat primates themselves?
Certainly around Gombe, there is a taboo against eating primates, particularly chimpanzees, so that's good. However, we do have problems with traps that are set for ungulates that chimpanzees will potentially step in and get caught. It's not as nearly as big as a problem as it is at Kibale, but...
When we come to humans, then we really encounter variation, and there's tremendous cultural variation even in the same parts of Africa in terms of people's interest in eating bushmeat, as it's called. And in some places, chimpanzees and gorillas are food. And it's been a huge conservation issue in parts of Central and West Africa. In Kibale, for example, fortunately, at least until recently, people living around this national park did not regard primates as food. That has started to change, initially with baboons, which cause a lot of problems because they raid people's crops, and also they are legally vermin in Uganda, so it's not illegal to kill them. But unfortunately, we do now have at least one case, and possibly more, of people going after chimpanzees to get meat. Hopefully that's not going to continue.
Thank you very much, David and Ian. Jill, we welcome you. And oh, you got another question? You going to ask me a question? Or?
I brought my own.
Okay, all right. Is it a good one?
I don't know. I didn't look at it.
Okay, all right. Well, I wanted to start off with just a question clarifying some of the methodological issues. If you could observe male and female Fongoni chimps equally, do you think that the amount of female hunting would increase, decrease, or stay the same?
Oh, I think it would definitely increase. So, like I said, we have focal male subjects that we follow from when they get up in the morning to when they go to sleep at night. We're taking data every 5 minutes. There are times of the year when they never leave our sight because we have really great visibility. The females are there, and it's a very cohesive community, so we're rarely without females. But again, I'm not targeting them. The thing about the bush baby hunting is it is audible. And so you can hear the sound of the tool hitting into the tree branch. So when I hear that, or if I see it, I abandon my male and I go observe whoever is hunting at the time. So we've got some good information on females, but I think that we're really underestimating what they're doing. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if the females are going to be doing it even more, do you already have a sense of the way this is inherited? Is there any possibility that the daughters of the mothers who hunt a lot with sticks, with tools, are doing it more themselves?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It's something we're looking at now. So we have enough data so we can look at individuals as they were infants, juveniles, adolescents, and now even some adults, and look at the behavior of their mother. So, I would expect that these two top high-ranking females that hunt a lot might have kids that are good hunters as well, and I would expect to see some sex differences like has been found at Gombe with termite fishing, but we're just kind of in the midst of analyses right now. Just qualitatively, there are some families, for example, I didn't mention Lucille, but she's also a prominent bush baby hunter, and her kids seem especially precocious in terms of hunting, and so I would expect to see some change, some differences there, but I'm just, I can't say for sure yet.
Okay, so meat theft, you said, is not very common in the Fongoli chimps. So there's a question about why that is. Is it because they all hunt, and so they're all getting lots of meat, or do they all hunt because theft is relatively rare?
I mean, I would kind of say the latter. Again, it's something that we're looking at. I think there's incentive to hunt. One of the hypotheses that I'm looking at is because of that skewed sex ratio, it could be that males are tolerant as a form of, mating strategy. That's just one of the hypotheses. And so do they share more with females that are in estrus or with certain females? I will say that preliminary data shows that there's not the support for the meat for sex hypothesis, but that is definitely a hypothesis we're looking at. So does this have to do, can this skewed sex ratio at Fongoli explain what I see as male tolerance? And again, we find some support for it with the preliminary evidence, so I expect it to hopefully stand up, not hopefully, but perhaps it will. But there are a number of different ideas. I guess one is that, there do seem to be some trends that you see in West African chimps where there might be some differences compared to East African subspecies, and so you see these grouping behaviors at Tai where you have a lot of males and females together. You see the same thing at Gombe. So that's also something that we're taking into account, or could it be a subspecies difference?
So, and with the sharing patterns, did you say that they share more with unrelated individuals than their own offspring?
They do.
Could you say a little bit more about that? That seems like a particularly odd thing to do.
Sure, yeah. So the females obviously haven't read the literature. And so we expected, a couple of hypotheses that we tested. One would be the kin selection hypothesis. You expect to share with your kids, and that we were really surprised. I don't know why I find it funny, but we were really surprised to find that was not the case. And not only did they share with adult males, but they also shared with adult females. And so that's definitely something that we're looking into. We have a bigger sample size, but I believe our initial analyses was of over 270 dyadic events. And so, that was really interesting. Males share with females as well as other adult males. And again, the meat for sex hypothesis has not been supported. So kids, offspring do get a share, but that is still surprising to me. They don't get more than they do.
So one final question about the hunting strategy. Do they already know when they're approaching a tree if there's a galago in there when they start poking with sticks, or is it just all exploratory?
That's a really good question. It's something that we're exploring now. So I have actually someone studying galagos at my site. She'll start next week. We've been trying to study them. We have various ways of doing it. But one of the big questions is the availability and counter rate. So I think it's opportunistic, but they do revisit sites where they've captured galagos before. It seems to me there's a definite age difference. So adults will abandon a site quite quickly. And so they may go up and just look in and leave it. They may go up, make a tool, stab around in there for a while. I don't know if you could see her doing that on the film, but they'll smell it and sometimes even taste the tip. And adults will abandon sites sometimes quite quickly, and then immature individuals will come and just keep at it for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So I assume that they can assess whether or not there's a galago there fairly quickly, but we're not sure. So we have different methods. We have a borescope that we've been using, which is what a plumber uses to look into drain pipes. And so I've been having my field assistant climb trees and use this borescope to try to see, what's going on. He doesn't really like that very much. That's only worked out so it's okay. But so now we're really doing systematic studies of the bush baby themselves, because we think a lot of what's going on, at least in terms of the tool-assisted hunting, and I didn't talk about it, but it's a very focused season. I call it bush baby season. That probably has to do a lot with the galago behavior itself. So.
I think it's just great that these new discoveries are still coming out, and it means that new students should be going out to the field, finding new places to do the kind of work that Jill has done. Thank you. Jim, I think it's time for me to turn over.
Yeah, so launch in. Margaret, are you still here? Hi, Margaret. Got some questions for you. And we've got a very specific one and a very general one. So this will kind of span the range.
Yes.
So which do you want first? I'll give you the specific one. Do columbine monkeys fit the C3C4 model that you presented, given their specialized digestive systems and their end-stage digestion process?
They do, actually. They don't eat C4. So they are actually going only after C3 leaves, or there is one that goes after lichens, and those happen to be C3. So yes, it's all C3.
Now for a slightly bigger picture. There's a theory that associates the consumption of meat not only with all the behavioral traits that made us human, but specifically with the encephalization, the evolution of larger brains in humans and other primates. Do you think, is this supported by the evidence, an association between consumption of meat and meat byproducts playing a role in encephalization?
I want to say that I happen to agree completely with Richard's point about the fat. The problem with fat is that it is not going to record in the appetite. It is not picked up. So the C3, C4 that I'm seeing cannot be fat. So there must be some meat eating going along because you don't see it. So the question is, do I think that has anything to do with encephalization? I think the fat does, because I think there's a lot of energy. And also, the very first tools we see, there are flakes. I'm not going to deny there are flakes, but there are a lot of pounding tools. And when I looked at the Hadza data and I was watching them, of course, they're pounding all the time because they're eating baobab seeds, and they're pounding. And I thought, I mean, why couldn't you just pound a bone and get the marrow out of it? Also, I should say at Kubifora, where Henry Bunn was working for a very long time looking at cut marks and crushed bone, what we noticed, or he noticed, I should say, and pointed out to me, is that every hippo jaw has a divot taken out of it, right where there is a big fat pad. So I found that extremely interesting because the energy from fat would actually feed a growing brain. And as Bob Martin always said, the female will grow the largest offspring she can with the largest brain across anything. Well, you increase the energy enormously, then I can see where you could actually end up with the mother producing a larger brained offspring to a limit of what her body can tolerate.
Well, I always like to make things more complicated than they need to be.
I know you do.
And
I wrote a paper with you.
well,
I should have said that, didn't I? Until afterwards.
And on that note,
yes.
As I understand it, there's sort of two ways to look at the role that that diet changes and that access to meat could play in encephalization. In one version, and fat would be included. In one version, obtaining this great nutrient source, perhaps only great once it's cooked, but nevertheless is a great nutrient source, enables us to grow a larger brain. The other version is that obtaining this easily digested nutrient source enables us to shrink our guts. And when our guts shrink, we're not spending as much energy metabolizing food, and so we have the surplus. It's not the surplus energy is then available to build the brain with there. And can you tease those apart at all?
Yeah, this is there was the hypothesis by Leslie Allo that you trade what's going on in the gut with the brain. And I have to go back to Bob Martin yet again and say that what he was pointing out was that you increase energy in, you decrease the gut, and it also can increase the brain. So the two are going together, but the way he liked to point it out, and I always thought it made a lot of sense, is that it's going through the mother. And so it's not so much that the animal themselves, but it makes the sense in terms of reproduction because it's going through the mother. So I definitely think the two are connected. You decrease the guts. You don't have to spend as much energy in processing your food. You have the energy left over, and it's usually more easily digested energy, whether it be fat or cooked meat. And yes, you can. I think it's always made sense to me that that's the way it worked.
Okay, thank you. Brianna, there were a couple of questions along the line, and you can see where this is coming from, a couple of questions along the line of, given these ideas about bone marrow availability, and actually Margaret touched on this, but what sort of actualistic data do you have on scavenging for the inside of bones? And any work going on bone marrow availability?
So any actualistic work going on that? That's a good question, and I don't think there has been as much actualistic work done on bone marrow. As far as thinking about the fossil record, though, I think, percussion marks were only recognized starting in 1988, and they're, I think, in some ways harder to recognize on fossils than cut marks are. And I have a really fun database that I try to keep up on, actually from the early Stone Age, all of the sites that have evidence for butchery marks, including both cut marks and percussion marks. And I think the percussion mark, I think that percussion marks are under-recognized and under-reported. So I'm really enjoying the conversations about the importance of marrow, because I think that's pretty significant.
Okay. There's a couple of related ones. I'll just sort of maybe ask them together because they'll play off of each other. You were working, and for good reason, you were working in a place that was a felid-dominated environment, but how would the presence of other scavengers, in particular hyenas, affect the availability of scavenged resources? And is there any way to then tie in the availability of scavenged resources to the absolute population that would be supportable, hominin population?
Okay, so the first question about, how do hyenas, what difference do hyenas make? So hyenas have very specialized dentition for basically crushing bone. And so once you get large populations of hyenas, they they clean up the African ecosystems. And so there are much fewer scavenging opportunities when hyenas are involved. So I don't know if that fully answers the first question, potentially. And the second question was about how would that make a difference for the overall hominin population that could be supported? Is that right? So I'm not sure we have good ways to model that and think about that, partially because I think hominins, like carnivores, were both pretty rare, generally on the landscape, certainly much more rare than herbivores. And so I don't think we can confidently extrapolate carnivore populations, or particularly like the proportions of felids versus hyenids in the past, necessarily just from the fossil record. The fossil record is all we have, but I think that certainly in an area where felids were dominant, and there were 3 different genera of saber-toothed felids that were around in the past at the times that we're talking about when hominins were first eating meat. And there have been propositions or hypotheses that it's actually scavenging potentially from saber-tooth kills. At least one of those genera probably was a solitary felid, more like leopards today may have stashed their kills in trees. And so those may have been really profitable scavenging opportunities for hominins. They're a little bit harder to model since we don't have saber-tooths around today.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that, because I know that there was a suggestion that some of the saber-tooths were specialists on very large animals, and the whole saber-tooth thing. There was a time when it was believed that their teeth are so brittle that all they could really do is kind of run in, slit the jugular, and then I think there was even a suggestion that they then lapped up the blood and didn't really get into the carcass at all, but otherwise that they would just eat the gut and leave the skeletal system completely intact. What's the status of that idea? Or do we know more about saber-tooths now?
So we will soon. So I'm doing a research project actually with a member of the audience, Jennifer Parkinson, right now, restudying a saber-tooth den collection in Texas, a Pleistocene den, where we have lots of saber-tooth fossils and we have lots of baby mammoths. So we think, or at least the idea is that saber-tooths are kind of dragging these baby mammoths and some adults as well, or mastodons, back to this den. And so we see tooth marks on some of these bones. So I think the idea that saber-tooths were only using their teeth potentially for killing and not for eating at all, and that they would leave a lot of the carcass left over, I'm not sure about that. They certainly were flesh specialists, though, so they did not have the kind of jaw and tooth capabilities that even probably modern lions have in order to break up bones, particularly of really big animals. So from really big kills of saber-tooths, especially if they were solitary, not social like lions were, I think that's a really good scavenging opportunity.
And when did lions come on the scene?
I think about somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago. So modern lions, leopards are basically around in some form by this time.
But the earliest stage, the sort of 3 to 4 million no lions.
Well, or at least not modern
something
lions. So certainly there were, things like lions around at that time.
All right. Specific question. And for some reason, I'm not sure this is the right word, but I can't remember it. Fecaliths, fossil coprolites.
Coprolite.
Yes. Yeah. Well, stone feces.
Mm-hmm.
How far back can coprolites give information about diet?
Ooh. I suspect the coprolites can give information about diet as far back as we can find them. And I know that there have been coprolite, at least carnivore coprolites found in the fossil record, I think, for the past few 100,000 years. I don't know so much about human coprolites, but I think that's an interesting line of evidence that would, I don't know if we need more of it, but it would be, I think it's a different and interesting line of evidence, but it sounds like there was more to the question.
Well, I don't know if this is a two-part question, I don't know the relationship, but the other part of this was, when does the first evidence of cannibalism appear? And I assume this is talking about dietary cannibalism?
Right. So the first evidence of cannibalism, there is, I believe it's a fossil skull from Sterkfontein, a site in South Africa that's about 2 million years old that has butchery marks on it. But so this is kind of one individual that seems to have decent cut marks on it. But the first evidence of more systematic cannibalism comes in, I believe, at about 400,000 years from a site in Spain, where there are hominins that are butchered basically in the same way that animals are butchered at this site. And so it seems like dietary or nutritive cannibalism is something that was rare just because hominins are rare, and so you're less likely to find them and less likely to find butchery marks on them. But I would suspect that probably for the entirety of the evidence for tool use in our evolutionary history. So.
That's grim. This is I'm tempted to ask John Speth to come up here, but there's a question. There's a question here about would fire be necessary to make scavenging safe? When we heard about the bacteria, and I mentioned John because he's written a really nasty paper on modern human scavenging or consumption of raw rotten meat. And if any of you have been to Iceland, I mean, rotten shark is a delicacy, so it is something that gets done. And I don't know.
That's a good question. I think the evidence that Margaret talked about in her talk about, or I think it was, or one of the speakers talked about with. The evidence for just bacterial growth and other things that can make scavengeable carcasses dangerous pretty quickly. I think it really depends on the timing of access to those carcasses. So if they're really quite fresh, I think you just use your nose. If they smell bad, if they look like they're disgusting, I suspect that they wouldn't be as useful for scavengeable resources.
Okay, so it'd be playing, okay.
Yeah, potentially.
Thank you.
Okay.
Richard. Since the high temperature cooking of animal fats can result in carcinogenic molecules, could this have been a problem that would have possibly led to increased, particularly gastrointestinal cancers during human evolution?
They'd have been so lucky to be able to have regular access to overheated fats, I would think. It seems to me very much a question about today's world, where we've dealt with a tremendous number of the basic nutritional problems, and we can afford to worry about the great detail of the costs that come along with all of the benefits. The important thing for the hominins would surely have been what it is for other primates and for hunters and gatherers today, which is getting enough access to energy. And the amount of carcinogenic impact I would have thought be definitely extremely small compared to the benefits coming from energy. However, you know, it's fascinating to think about the possibility that there has been some kind of adaptation to some of the deleterious byproducts that come from cooking. And so Maillard compounds is this very complicated family of compounds that are produced by the ultimately the interaction of sugars and amino acids, and they're basically unique in their concentration when produced by cooking. And there is a little bit of sort of anecdotal evidence that humans are less susceptible to the deleterious consequences of some Maillard compounds than in other animals. And this is a fascinating area to explore.
Okay, so you're looking at it, yeah.
Well, I'm not looking at it.
Well, no, but I mean, you're looking at the question of whether other people are looking at it. Yeah,
no.
It will become a datum for you. Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting. When I started grad school, the story of human evolution was fairly simple. There was a gracile Australopithecine, and it gave rise to a Homo, and then it gave rise to advanced Homo, and then here we are. And we now know that there's a lot of bushiness in the family tree. Do you believe that cooking food evolved once or more than once in the hominin lineage?
Well, believe is a little strong because, this is not a religion, this is science.
In your opinion, is there evidence supporting?
So the way I reconstruct it, there's this conflict between the biological and the archaeological evidence, I think of it. And the biological evidence pushes us to saying that the change in the shape of the ribs indicating the smaller gut that Margaret referred to, the smaller teeth, the weaker jaw muscles, a bunch of these anatomical changes, they all happen just this side of 2 million years, let's say. And so that's the biological evidence. The archaeological evidence is that fire came in very late. To me, the fascinating question about this is what is going to resolve it? And if it turns out that for some reason we're able to get convinced that fire really wasn't controlled prior to, say, 500,000 years ago, or just very, very occasionally. There are sites like Van der Werk in South Africa, which has it at 1 million and maybe a little bit more. But if it turns out that fire was controlled relatively late like that, then what on earth was responsible for the gracilization and reduction of the human digestive system if it wasn't cooking? And to me, what is so interesting is that nobody's really suggested what that could be. The only thing that I can think of is that there would be a pretty much 100% focus on marrow fats or on fats. And the reason I say that is you've got to go close to 100%. First of all, that doesn't take much tooth work. And second, let's see, where was I? I'm so excited about this story.
You were pointing out that thoroughly rotten meat doesn't take much tooth work either.
Yes, but that's not the point I wanted to make here. The point I wanted to make is that as long as the hominins had to resort sometimes to eating plants, then they needed to have the more robust jaws, the bigger teeth, the bigger guts to be able to process them in the mouth and then ferment them in the colon. And until you can overcome the need to eat raw plants at some time, then I don't see how you can get to that reduced digestive system of humans. So for that reason, it's just very, very difficult for me to imagine that the evidence of the control of fire won't come up to something around 1.9 million years ago. But if it doesn't, then somebody in the audience solved that problem. What did they eat?
Ocean food? What about mechanical processing of food?
Yes.
Well, okay. All right. So what about mechanical processing of food? And Katie Zink and Dan Lieberman have said that, that this would make it easier to chew. So the problem I have with that is that, to my knowledge, we don't have any examples from modern hunter-gatherers of processing of plants for pounding to eat raw. And it's kind of difficult to imagine exactly how it is going to work to eat raw. You know, I mean, to pound the seeds and then put them into, well, a pot makes it particularly easy, or a damper, you know, a sort of pancake type of thing that you can put on the fire. That's fine. But what, you reduce this pounded to something that you can eat as a powder? And remember that starch grains are not normally broken down by pounding. So to the extent that the plant part is important for producing starch, which should be very important, then pounding is going to be no good. You need cooking to get the starch reduced to glucose. Rebecca's got a...
Mardu and most Aboriginal groups that relied on wild tomatoes pounded them up. So they're pounding fruit. And part of the reason they're pounding up the fruit is to concentrate the energy so you can carry it and keep it long distances.
Oh, reducing the water.
Yeah.
This is all water, yeah. And also you can actually access some of the protein in the seeds by pounding it.
Okay, so that sounds great, but it doesn't sound as though it would necessarily increase the net energy value.
It may not sound at all to the people in the back. Let me just repeat. Let me just repeat that Rebecca was pointing out that among the people she works with in Australia, that they pound tomatoes and other fruits in order to reduce the water content and make them more compact and easier to carry.
We got other questions here. Are we allowed to take these?
Baobab seeds are 36% fat. And so when they pound them, they usually, and Melissa has obviously looked at them longer than I did, they didn't cook it.
Okay, so another example from the Hadza of East Africa.
And you do it twice, because of course you can do it when the baobab seeds are ripe, and then you do it when the baboons have cooked it out, which makes it easier.
So it's another ethnographic counterexample where people are pounding baobab seeds to access the high-fat seed within. So there are a few examples, and the devil may be in the details of how widespread they are. So mechanical processing is important some places. Okay.
My masculine...
How's your masculinity?
Yeah, it's...
Well, that's not good. Are there any human cultures that have lost fire?
No.
Thank you. Okay. I just, this is, I don't know if this is, well, I'll just give you this one. You can decide whether or not to address that.
The question about losing fire, the question that people do investigate more often is whether people have lost the ability to make fire for themselves. And there are some claims that might have happened, but it doesn't seem relevant because they can always get fire. By going to the neighbors. Basically, once you have a population maintaining fire, then
I
they
saw
can keep
the movie
going.
Quest for Fire.
Exactly. And am I aware that there is something called the Roadkill Cookbook? As a model of the origins of the human predatory pattern, I'm dubious.
It might tie in with running, though. There are two last, you can either stay here or not. There are two last questions. I'm not sure if we really have time to address them, although they're directed to all the speakers. I want to read them because I think what they do is they fit very nicely into what CARTA is all about. And there's one. Obviously, a switch to meat eating induced a radical change in digestive systems, underlying genetics. How did we get from there, from here to there, or from there to here, in any case? So what are the underlying genetics involved in the restructuring of the body? And then a second one is, I don't know if this is a mildly aggressive question, but it's okay. Where does your understanding of nutrition come from? How much do you consult with nutritionists and nutritional scientists? How does it impact your interpretations of observations if some of your fundamental beliefs about nutrition are flawed? I think that the reason that I like those questions, and I'll give you a chance to address it, but I like those questions because they both have built into them this incredible interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary complexity of understanding this problem. We've got people who, who study chimpanzees or who look at cut marks on bones, and in order to interpret what they're doing, we need to know some genetics and we need to know some nutrition. There's a lot of fields that have to come together. In the normal course of events, people in these different areas go to conferences with other people in their own areas, and they talk to other people who study bones or who study apes or whatever. CARTA is one of these a really great venue, I think, that brings together people from these different specialties. We can't, we probably don't have as wide a net present in this room or at this symposium as we could use, but it's still wider than we normally get, and we start to try to get at some of these questions, put these pieces together. With that said, how do you interact with, and this again is for all of us, on the nutrition specifically, where do you get the interaction, and how much do you try to go for it?
Nutritional science is a very funny science. Marion Nestle.
Says the guy who works on chimps.
Marion Nestle is this very good biochemist who was invited to do to teach a course something like 20, maybe 25 years ago on nutrition because the department needed it, and she hadn't gone into that area at all. And she tells the story about how she got 8 textbooks and opened them up and put them in a row on a desk and then saw what everybody said. And she said the answers were just incredibly different. So there is a real danger, or there was then, and even now, I think there is a danger of being able to cherry pick what results you want. So having said that, let me just mention about cooking, because well, I mean, look, the fact is that cooking is hugely important for humans, okay? And so you would think that we would have a lot of information about what the impact of cooking is on the energy value of foods. And I was astounded when almost 20 years ago I started thinking about the importance of cooking, and I went to the nutritional literature, and it wasn't there. It was really, really difficult to find. In our lab, we did the first darned experiments to looking at the impact of cooking on meat and its digestibility and the cost of digestion associated with it. And I've just said that you do not have any data at the moment on the impact on what I think of as the most important macronutrient in human evolution, namely animal fats. So where do we go for nutritional science? You have to very often make it up yourself.
Alyssa, yes. And I think this will be the last sort of response.
Oh,
yeah.
This is not a very exciting end to the, but I think that was a really important question. So whoever posed that, thank you. This is something I struggle with daily, weekly, monthly. I do a lot of presentations and a lot of conferencing with nutritional sciences, food sciences, chemists. I do a lot of work with the nutrition community. So me personally, I do a lot of work that is totally embedded in nutrition, and I blame Margaret for that. I blame Margaret because I came to graduate school here at UCSD, and I wanted to ask these big, grandiose questions about how ecology influences behavior and reproduction, and I was using food as my metric, and Margaret said, "That's great, but what is in the food, right? What are you actually measuring?" And I hadn't thought about that, and I hate to admit this, but I think a lot of the literature doesn't really think about that, particularly the literature as far as it pertains to human foraging populations. And we have people in here, Kristen Hawkes, Nick Blurton-Jones, and colleagues who were one of the very first teams that actually decided to work with nutritional chemists to figure out what's in forager foods. So personally, I do a lot of work in nutrition sciences. It's very messy. And I will say that in the early 2000s, when I came back with wild Hadza foods, no commercial nutrition lab would take my foods. So Richard's lab is where I did all of my analyses of Hadza foods with a fantastic nutrition scientist named Nancy Lou Conklin-Britton, who I think can beat the pants off anyone in terms of thinking about how to use all of these different methods. And she will often analyze a wild food, with 4 different laboratory methods that she's found from all over the world and figure out where they overlap. So I think it depends on who you're asking in terms of our relationship with nutrition, but I think that as a discipline in general, particularly for those of us that are talking about food in general, it's very important to think about the nutritional components. And there are people, John Speth is in here somewhere, who really do this and do it very well, but there's not enough. So graduate students, go learn nutritional chemistry, please. It will serve you well, I promise.
I was supposed to spend about 5 minutes summarizing the symposium, and I cleverly let the questions go on to pretty much chew up that time, because I think answering your questions is a lot more important than listening to what I might come up with. I will just say that the genesis for this symposium came from the fact that I work at a savanna chimpanzee study site where we have Redcolobus, and our chimps don't seem to eat them. And so I was presented with this puzzle about chimpanzee hunting, and the reason we work there is to try to gain insight into the conditions that early hominins might have had. And so I started trying to pull all this together and contacting smart people who know more about both modern hunting and about chimpanzees than I do. And I've been tremendously pleased and learned quite a lot in the process. I hope you have as well. I would like to now, so that's my summary as far as it goes. I'd now like to give you to Ajit Varki.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the CARTA team and all those who made the symposium possible, the chairs, the featured speakers, sponsors and supporters, and to the audience for attending and for the great questions and really exciting and interesting symposium. And I'd like to remind you that we have upcoming symposia, and you can look them up on the web, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.